All right, so our last section that we have in westward expansion is really talking about conflicts that took place out west. And so, really going to talk about Native Americans, but first, I want to kind of really emphasize the fact that the problem with Native Americans in the United States wasn't the only conflict that was taking place out west. In fact, there were lots of groups of people who weren't getting along. And so, we call these disagreements between people out west the range wars. And so some of the groups were, for example, we've already talked about the ranchers and the cowboys did not get along with the farmers. The farmers were putting barbed wire fence around their land, and the ranchers and cowboys were not able to go on their cattle jobs because of that. And so ranchers and cowboys did not get along with farmers. The second group of people, or groups of people who did not get along, were the Mexican Americans and just the pioneers in general. A lot of the Mexican Americans had immigrated into the United States before westward expansion. And so when the pioneers came over on the Homestead Act, they were taking land that many of the Mexican Americans had been living on for a while. And so Mexican Americans did not get along with the pioneers. And so when we talk about the Native Americans, in particular Geronimo, he's actually going to help those Mexican Americans fight against the United States. So those are a couple of the range wars that were going on. But the most popular one, or the biggest one, and the one we're going to spend the most time, is the problem between the United States and the Native Americans. So we'll jump right into it. What the government wanted to do is they wanted to take over land out west for a couple of reasons. They wanted to use it to build railroads. They wanted to use it to grow farms. They wanted people to start their own towns out west. Well, the problem was a lot of this land was already owned
Weston, please
by
enter
Native
the same
Americans.
room.
So the Native Americans already controlled or were living on a lot of this land that the government was wanting. So what the United States did is they offered the Native Americans money and stuff. They tried to buy the land from them. Well, the problem with that is Native Americans didn't use money. They didn't care about money. They didn't care about stuff. And so the Native Americans weren't willing to sell that land to the United States government because they didn't care for their money. It didn't mean anything to them. So what did the government do? Well, the United States decides to create something called a reservation. A reservation was this land that the United States took and set aside for Native Americans, but they forced the Native Americans to go and live on these reservations. So the Native Americans didn't want to sell their land, so what the United States government does is it chooses land elsewhere and forces the Native Americans to move to that land they chose so that they could have the original land to use however they wanted. So yeah, you'll need to know that reservations are land that's set aside for Native Americans. So not only did we force them to these reservations, and when I say we, I'm talking about the United States. The United States forced these Native Americans to go to these reservations, but not only did they do that, they also tried to change their culture. In other words, we wanted to force the Native Americans to live on land that we gave them, and we wanted to force them to behave like white Americans do. And so we tried to force them to accept American traditions and American customs. And a couple of ways we did that. The first way we did that is this Dawes Severalty Act. And I'm going to put 5 stars by the Dawes Severalty Act. You need to remember what the Dawes Severalty Act did. What the Dawes Severalty Act did is it divided these reservations into land for Native American families. And that's a very white American way of thinking. In our culture, we say, this is my piece of land. It belongs to me. You don't come onto my land unless I invite you. And so each family has their own house, their own yard, their own piece of land. Well, Native Americans believed much differently. They believed in sharing everything. So when we put them on the reservations and we divided up the land for families, we were forcing them to treat land the way that Americans treated land. And so that was one of the ways that we tried to make them accept our traditions and our customs. And I promise you, you're going to see questions about the Dawes Severalty Act on every single test you take this year. So really, really important to remember. Another thing we did is we built schools on these reservations, and the schools didn't teach the children how to read and write and do math. The schools tried to teach the children how to dress and what foods to eat and which holidays to celebrate. Again, we were trying to force these Native Americans on the reservations behave like good Americans. So that's kind of what life was like on the reservations for these Native Americans. A really, really unfair way to treat these people. What I want to do is tell you a couple stories, and these stories are perfect examples of the way that we treated Native Americans. And so the first story is the Lakota tribe. The Lakota tribe was a Plains Indian tribe who lived in the middle of the country, and essentially the United States wanted the Lakota land. They wanted to build railroads and that kind of stuff. And so what we do is we offer to pay for it and that kind of thing. Well, we eventually work out this agreement with the Lakota tribe. And what we tell the United States government tells the Lakota tribe is that we will give them land in South Dakota in the Black Hills, and it'll be the Great Lakota Reservation. And what we say is we will never, ever, ever bother you again. So if you make this agreement, you give us this land, we will give you that land, and we will never, ever, ever bother you again. That was the agreement. That was the treaty between the United States and the Lakota. So the Lakota accept that, and they move into the Black Hills, and everything is fine until they find gold. And we already talked about with miners, gold was a huge, huge reason why people moved out west. So as soon as it was found out that there was gold in these Black Hills on this Lakota reservation, miners started to rush into the area illegally. They weren't supposed to go there, but they went anyway. So what does the United States government do? Well, they say, I know that we told you we would never, ever, ever bother you again, but we would like to buy this land back from you. So they realized that the Lakota reservation was valuable land, and so they tried to buy it back. Well, Sitting Bull, who is one of the people I want you to remember, he was the leader of the Lakota tribe, and he says, I'm not selling anything back to you. He picks up dirt between his fingers. He said, I wouldn't even sell you this much. So the government tries to buy that land back, and the Lakota tribe and Sitting Bull says no. So what does the U.S. military do? They decide to send troops and take the land back. So they offered to buy it. They said no. They said, we're going to take it anyway. And so George Custer was the guy, the general who was in charge of the United States military, who was sent to beat Sitting Bull and take back this land in the Black Hills. So George Custer takes his troops and he goes to fight Sitting Bull, and they fight at something called the Battle of Little Bighorn. The Battle of Little Bighorn. And it's called the Battle of Little Bighorn because it happened on the Little Bighorn River. And so George Custer attacks Sitting Bull. But what George Custer didn't know is that Sitting Bull had a Native American kind of warrior who was fighting for him, and his name was Crazy Horse. And so what Crazy Horse does is Crazy Horse fights for Sitting Bull in the Lakota, and Crazy Horse and his men, they kill George Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so the Battle of Little Bighorn is also known as Custer's Last or Custer's Final Stand. Crazy Horse kills Custer. This victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn, at Custer's Last Stand, is the biggest Native American victory in these fights that happen between the government and the Native Americans. And so what does the government decide to do once George Custer is killed? Well, the government decides that they need stronger action. And so what they do is they send more troops, and they send more troops. And eventually the American military and the American government forces the Lakota to a brand new reservation, and the Black Hills become part of they become owned by the United States, and miners are able to go and mine the gold. Interestingly enough, Sitting Bull, who was that leader of the Lakota tribe, he escapes up to Canada, but most of the Lakota Indians were forced to a new reservation, and we're going to come back to them in just a little bit. So that's kind of the story of the Lakota tribe. So the other story I wanted to tell you was about Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce tribe. Essentially, the government wanted the Nez Perce land, and so what does Chief Joseph do? Chief Joseph and his tribe, they run away. Well, you would think when they run away, they leave the land behind them, and so you would think that the government would just take the land and be done with it. But that's not the case. The government actually chases Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, and they chase them up towards Canada because Chief Joseph was trying to get to where Sitting Bull was in Canada. So the government chases after Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, and General Miles and the government, they eventually catch Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce tribe, and they make a false promise to him. What General Miles tells him is he says, Chief Joseph, and if you and your tribe surrender, we're going to send you back home to Oregon. So in other words, if you surrender, we will send you back home. So Chief Joseph says, hey, that sounds like a good deal. And so he agrees. And once he agrees, the Nez Perce were actually forced to a new reservation in Oklahoma, which is hundreds of miles away from Oregon. So he agrees because he thinks that he's going to go back home. The government tells them that they're going to go back home, and they get sent hundreds of miles away to somewhere else. Again, that story shows you the way we treated these Native Americans during this time. The last group that I wanted to mention was the Apache, and the Apache were led by a guy named Geronimo. And the biggest thing to remember about Geronimo is they were the last tribe to fight against the Americans. Geronimo fought against the American forces as long as he possibly could. He also helped these groups fight against Mexican and American troops, and so the Apache and Geronimo really were kind of the last survivors of the Native Americans who fought back against kind of being taken over and forced to a reservation. And so that's the biggest thing to remember about Geronimo. So let's go back to that Lakota tribe, the very first tribe that we mentioned. So I told you the Lakota tribe was forced to a new reservation after they were forced off of the Black Hills. Well, what those Lakota tribe members decide is they decide one day they want to escape the reservation. And so they leave. They kind of run away from the reservation. Well, again, the United States government, the military, chases after them. And once they chase after them, they catch up to them at a place called Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And what happened at Wounded Knee is actually really, really sad. The Lakota members, once they were caught, they completely surrendered. They said they weren't going to fight back. They said, we will go back to the reservation. We surrender. Well, it just so happens somebody accidentally fires a shot off. And once they do that, the military just start to shoot into the Lakota tribe. And they end up killing 300 of the tribe members. And most of those people were women and children. And so the Lakota tribe was devastated because of this event at Wounded Knee. And we consider this kind of the last battle between Native Americans and the United States in this westward expansion. And so Wounded Knee was a really sad event in American history. And it was really unfortunate that a lot of innocent people, a lot of innocent Native Americans who were completely surrendering ended up dying there. So what does it all mean? Well, it shows you that our relationship between Native Americans in the past has been one that's really difficult. And if you think about some of the really bad parts of American history, the way we treated the Native Americans is really close to the top. We were very unfair, very mean, and took advantage of the Native Americans. In fact, if you look here, over half of Native Americans still live on or near reservations today. If you've ever been up towards Catawba or up in Oconee County, Native Americans still live near those reservations or on those reservations today. The United States has tried to do things to make it better. We have offered money to Native Americans. They have certain tax breaks, things that they can do to try to make up for the past. And so Native Americans have gotten things because the United States has realized how difficult or how badly we treated them during this time period. So that's kind of the last group that we talk about when we're thinking about westward expansion. When we talk about these conflicts, we have the ranchers and the cowboys not getting along with the farmers. We have Mexican Americans not liking the pioneers. But the biggest one is we have the United States government fighting with the Native Americans and taking advantage of Native Americans and forcing them to reservations and passing things like the Dawes Severalty Act, which divides that reservation land up for families, and trying to make them accept white customs and those kind of things and traditions. And so it really was a struggle out west. And so it kind of goes along with the whole theme that life out west was really, really difficult. And so that brings us to the end of westward expansion. Next, we'll be looking kind of at the Industrial Revolution and some new inventions and things that were going on in our country that were had to do with industry and that kind of thing. But that's the end of westward expansion. All right, I think we're good to go. Have an awesome day.